I think this is recording. I'm never sure. Yep, it's recording. I thought I'd make a video. It's been 24 hours. Try to make one every day if I can. Today is Monday. It is the 9th of May. It is going on 8:55 at night. See. I'm sitting here in the dining room. Going to make a video, and I was making a video. I thought I'd make a video about how do we discover new writers and poets? Maybe some of you people don't read poetry, but I've always been into some kind of poetry. Mainly, for years I was into beat poetry, Allen Ginsberg and Gary Snyder and Philip Larkin and Gregory Corso. But I've been getting into more poetry now that I'm retired. The point is that I mentioned this book, American Smoke, Journeys to the End of the Light by Iain Sinclair. I've mentioned this book twice in my videos, and I did a reread of it because I was dipping into it yesterday, and I really wanted to reread it, but reread it and write down all the poets and writers that he mentions, because that's what the book is about. It says here that he wrote this book. He's revisiting in Iain Sinclair is British. He lives in London, and he decides to trace his roots as a writer and as a poet. It says here in the beginning of his book, it was a season of autumn ghost, a dampness in the soul. 2011, and London had lost its savor, a good step beyond midway through my dark wood of the world. I came to America hoping to reconnect with the heroes of my youth. And so throughout this book, he reconnects with the heroes of his youth. But what I want to do is just go through the poets and writers that he mentions as poets and writers that we can look into their writings and their poetry to discover new writers and new poets. So the first person he mentions in the book, his first hero of his youth, is Charles Olson. Now, Charles Olson was a poet. Last year I read this biography by Tom Clark, Charles Olson, The Allegory of a Poet's Life. Usually when I buy a biography of a poet, I try to get their collected works or all their poetry. I haven't done this in this case. I have not got Charles Olson's poetry, but you will find some of his poems in this book here. This is a book, it's right here. Let me see if I can find it. Let's see, I think he's in here. Oh, I was wrong. He's not. Oh, yeah, it says right here. It has Statements of Poetics by Charles Olson. Projective Verse is in here. But I don't see any poetry. I thought there was. This is a very famous anthology. It's called New American Poetry, edited by Donald M. Allen. This was printed first in 1960. It's a very famous. You have all the poets in here, the Beats and the San Francisco poets. Oh, here it is, Charles Olson, right here, right here. He was born in 1910, and I can't remember when he died, but he was one of the first. He really influenced a lot of poets in the 60s. And so, yeah, so that's the first person he mentions Iain Sinclair in American Smoke is Charles Olson. So check out his biography. It's written by Tom Clark. Tom Clark is a poet. He lives in Berkeley, California. He has a great blog and website. Check out Tom Clark. The next person that he mentions, he goes into in this book, is Robert Blanco. Robert Blanco was a Chilean writer. He also lived in Mexico City, and he became very famous for this novel, The Savage Detectives, a novel by Roberto Bellino. This is this deals with, it says here, in this dazzling novel, the book that established his international reputation, Robert Bellino tells the story of two modern-day coyotes, the last survivors of an underground literary movement, perhaps of literature itself, a tragicomic quest through a darkening, utopic universe, our own. So it goes, it's about poets and poetry. So he mentions that book in here. And then he mentions Ed Sanders. Ed Sanders was he was a poet. He was also in a band called the Fugs back in the 60s, but he wrote a lot of poetry. He lives in Woodstock, New York, and this is his book, Thirsting for Peace in a Raging Century, Selected Poems, 1961 to 1985 by Edward Sanders. So he mentions him. He was, Ed Sanders also wrote a biography in poetry form of Allen Ginsberg. I have in my study. So he mentions him. And then he mentions John Winters. He was a poet from Boston, Massachusetts. He was a disciple of Charles Olson. I just bought this recently. Stars Seen in Person, Selected Journals by John Winters. He's also in this anthology of the New American Poetry. I'm sure he's in here. He's a very famous poet. Let me see here. John Winters. Let me see here. John Winters. Yeah, right here is his poetry. He was born in 1934. They have some poetry by John Winters in the New American Poetry. And then he mentions, in my notes, he mentions the writer Malcolm Lowry, who's very famous for his novel Under the Volcano. This is a very famous novel, and so check that out. And then he mentions Jack Kerouac, who wrote a book of poetry. Not only did he write On the Road, which he's very famous for, Jack Kerouac, but he also wrote a book of poetry called Mexico City Blues. I have this on cassette with Allen Ginsberg reading Mexico City Blues. So yeah. So this is a book of poetry by Jack Kerouac. Mentioning Ginsberg. This is his collected poems. Allen Ginsberg, 1947 to 1997. He's very famous, Kerouac, for his Howl. This is a 50th anniversary edition of Howl. Original draft, facsimiles, transcript, variant versions, fully annotated by the author with contemporaneous correspondence, account of first public reading, legal skirmishes, precursor text, and bibliography. That's Howl 50th Anniversary Edition. Of course, he's mentioned in this book of the San Francisco poets. Usually, Allen Ginsberg is more considered an East Coast poet, not necessarily a San Francisco poet. But in this anthology, a person that would be considered a San Francisco poet would be like Kenneth Roxworth, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Lou Rich, Richard Bronigan, people like that. He also mentions in the American Smoke the poet who was also an East Coast poet. He was usually associated with Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs as Gregory Curso. This is his poetry, his book of poems. He's very famous, Curso, for his book of poems, Gasoline. He's, let me see, there's a poem I like by him. It's called Bomb by Curso. Let me see if I can read that to you. Curso, it's called Bomb. Well, it's kind of long. Maybe I won't read it. I didn't know it was that long. Yeah, it's like 5 pages long. But anyway, my favorite poems by Curso is called Bomb. So then he also has, he was Iain Sinclair. He traces a lot of his writings to William Burroughs. This is a novel by William Burroughs. It's called The Place of Dead Roads. Of course, William Burroughs is known for his novel Junkie, Naked Lunch, Soft Machine, The Ticket That Exploded, Dead Fingers Talk, The Age Letters, The Third Mind Novel Express, The Job, The Wild Boys, Exterminator, Port of Saints, The Last Words of Dutch Solch, Cities of the Red Night. But I thought I'd just show you for an example. This is one of William Burroughs' novels. He wrote a lot of novels besides Junkie and Naked Lunch, which he's famous for. So that's William Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, Curso, the San Francisco poets, John Wieners, Hal. And also he goes into An American Smoke. Iain Sinclair he mentions William Gibson. William Gibson was a science fiction writer. I have his writings. This is an example. This is the Neuromancer by William Gibson. This won the Book of the Year, winner of the Hugo, Nebula, and Philip K. Dick Awards. It's a very famous novel by William Gibson. William Gibson has put out a lot of novels. He's still putting out novels, but that's William Gibson. So when you talk about Ginsberg, I wanted to mention that when I was in seminary back in the 80s, I went and saw Ginsberg and got a photo of me with Ginsberg. There's me when I was young, and there's Ginsberg. Here's Ginsberg up on the stage. This was at a small liberal arts black college in Jackson, Mississippi, back in 1980s summer. You can tell it was summer because I'm sweating. It's really hot in there. They had no air conditioner in this old church. But there is me, and there's Ginsberg. So yeah, so when you read a book like American Smoke, you come across writers like Malcolm Lowry, William Gibson. You become across poets like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and Curso, and writers like William Burroughs and writers like William Gibson. And you can go, and what I do is when I come across somebody like that, I write them down on a piece of paper, and then I go and I check them on Amazon or read book reviews. Like today I copied off book reviews on American Smoke. This is from the Washington Post. This is a book review on American Smoke. This is an article I copied off on Roberto Bellino in the New York School of Poetry. Bellino was influenced by the New York poets like Frank O'Hare. Is that Frank O'Hare or John O'Hare? Anyway, also Charles Olson, and it mentions that here in this article. Also, this is a book review of Paris Vagabond by Jean-Paul Sabertz I've been talking about. And so I go online and I look up these poets, I look up these writers, I read reviews of their books, I go to Amazon, read summaries of their writings, and that's how you come to become educated and know about writers and poets. Get anthologies like the New American Poetry, read the poems, read the San Francisco Poets Anthology. If you really get into a poet, get their complete writings. This is Ginsberg's. And open your mind and learn new things. And check out Roberto Bellino's Savage Detectives. And so I just want to share those thoughts tonight about how you discover new writers and new poets. Until the next time, bye.